One of my favourite things when I meet MPs, or when I meet kind of generally journalists, is to ask them, what do you think the average median wage in Britain is? You say, so half of the country earns less, half of the country earns more. Usually from MPs or from journalists, you'll get an estimate of £50,000 a year. In fact, as everyone here knows, it's 23,000. Holly Toynbee did a brilliant thing. She did a focus group with some Goldman Sachs bankers, and she asked them to name the income that they think should be the poverty level for Britain. So, no one should live below it, and below that you would be considered to be poor. They estimated £40,000. When she told them that 90% of British people live below that, they said, "You're lying, that's not true." And these inequalities disfigure Britain in so many different ways that we see every day. One of the most amazing examples for me, go to Westminster and get on the tube, on the Jubilee line, and go 6 stops to Canning Town. At every stop, if you were born there, it knocks 2 years off your life expectancy. I was born in a city, Glasgow, where the average male life expectancy is 61. That's lower than the male life expectancy in the Gaza Strip. And if you look at the ways this affects us, there's a brilliant book, and Kate, who's coming, is the author of it, in fact, called The Spirit Level, that looks at the different ways this inequality transforms Britain in ways that really have a terrible effect on all of us. One of them is, it's really interesting, we now know something, a very important magic number, and it's the number at which growing wealth stops making you happy. If you go to Congo, if you go to Ethiopia, there's an obvious way to make people happier. Give them more food, give them the ability to keep themselves warm. At a certain level, up to a certain level, obviously having more stuff makes you happier. But we now know that once you reach $25,000 a year, something strange happens. Diminishing returns kick in. You actually stop being made happier. At quite a rapid rate, the graph tails off. So, and when you reach the level of income that we now have in Britain, the average person, actually running harder and harder on a treadmill to get more and more stuff doesn't make you happy. And there's some interesting questions about why that is. One of the most interesting reasons is, as you run more and more, you get a more unequal society. And that actually, the level of inequality we now live with, we now know, is something that is not very well suited to our species. We evolved in hunter-gatherer tribes that were incredibly egalitarian, and we still carry with us all the cultural expectations of those hunter-gatherer tribes. And one of them is, in those tribes you didn't get gaps of, the person at the top was not 100 times richer, didn't have 100 times more stuff, didn't have 100 times more status than the person at the bottom. We didn't evolve for those kind of gaps. They're very weird to us. And actually, we now know what happens when you have those gaps. If you compare Japan and Sweden, right? Really different countries, culturally hugely different. But they have one important thing in common. They have relatively low inequality for a developed country. And in return, what do they have? They have really low levels of violence, really low levels of mental illness, really low levels of crime, really low levels of people in prison, and really high life expectancies. Now, if you look at countries that are very unequal but relatively developed, again, the figures run the other way. They have very high levels of crime, they have high levels of mental illness, and as we've become more like that, we've accumulated all these factors. There's lots of reasons why, but one is, when a human being's status is threatened, when you feel that you are so much lower than someone else, which is not something we evolved to cope with for very long, it has a physical effect on your body. When you feel your status is threatened, we can look at this in monkeys, we look at this in human beings, your body releases something called cortisol, which is basically a stress drug, because it's very stressful to feel, why has he got so much, why has he got all this stuff that I will never have, that never in my lifetime will I achieve this? And usually, like Jacob Rees-Mogg, it's not because they've done anything, it's not like, Jacob Rees-Mogg is a genius, although he does refer to people who went to state schools as potted plants, in his interview. But it's not like, the kid at a state school, proved to be unable and he proved to be very able. The opposite is the case. This man is extremely thick, but has risen very high. But when you are faced with those gaps, huge vertiginous gaps that are unearned and very cruel and increasingly unbridgeable, your body reacts and you feel very threatened. Cortisol is a good thing to be released in short doses if you're in danger. So if you're being chased by a lion, you want your body to flood you with cortisol because you want to get away from the lion. But in societies where there is very extreme inequality, cortisol levels, interestingly, not just in people at the bottom, but people at the top as well, although not as much, rise. They rise significantly. It's very stressful to be surrounded by people in these huge gaps. And that's one of the main reasons why we have these differentials. A good way of looking at it is, there was a study the other day, University of North Carolina studied some macaque monkeys and divided them into groups of 4 based on status. You know, so it made sure the top group had loads and the group at the bottom had nothing. And obviously the group at the bottom very quickly became very depressed and dejected and unhappy and started showing all signs of dysfunction, which is precisely what humans do. And it gave these monkeys the ability to pull a little bar. And if they did it, they got some cocaine. And the monkeys who were in the top group would pull it occasionally and get a little bit high. But the monkeys at the bottom pulled it chronically and got terribly addicted. Now, we know with other macaque groups that aren't so unequal, they don't do that. They all, when they have relatively equal macaque groups, they all take a little bit of coke, but not very often. But in the unequal group, everyone took more, and the group at the bottom took so much they became chronically addicted and some of them died.